22분입니다. 주문, 시청구인 대통령 윤석열을 파면한다.
Yoon Suk-yeol is only the second South Korean president to be removed from office. His rapid climb from the prosecutor's office to South Korea's highest seat, the presidency, was followed by a spectacular fall from grace. This is the story of Yoon Suk-yeol's meteoric rise and fall. Before entering politics, Yoon was known as an anti-corruption crusader. As a prosecutor, he played a key role in the impeachment of South Korean President Park Geun-hye in 2016. 3 years later, Yoon was the country's top prosecutor and indicted Park's successor, Moon Jae-in, in a fraud and bribery case. It was his role in those cases that caught the eye of the conservative People Power Party. Leaders of what was then the opposition party convinced Yoon to become their presidential candidate. During his campaign, Yoon promised to fight unemployment as well as out-of-control home prices and corruption. He pledged to adopt a hard stance against North Korea and Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions, and to abolish South Korea's Ministry of Gender Equality. While this didn't sit well with women voters, his program appealed to a young male demographic and the elderly. In March 2022, Yoon won the election, defeating the ruling Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung by the slimmest margin in South Korea's history.
위대한 국민의 승리가 아닌가 그렇게 생각을 합니다.
Not long after his victory, Yoon's approval ratings began to sink. In 2022, his administration was criticized for its handling of the deadly Halloween crowd crush in Seoul that killed more than 150 people. South Korean citizens also blamed his government for food price inflation, a lagging economy, and increased limits on freedom of speech. Yoon maintained a tough stance against North Korea and bolstered ties with Seoul's traditional ally, the United States. He also worked to strengthen Seoul's cooperation with Washington's other allies. However, his actions did not sit well with many citizens, including those opposed to Yoon's efforts to supply Ukraine with weapons and to build ties with South Korea's former colonial ruler, Japan. Yoon also had to battle a series of scandals surrounding his wife Kim Kyung-hee and her family. She falsified her resume and faked academic credentials when she tried to secure a teaching job. There were accusations that Kim and her family manipulated the stock price of an auto dealership. She was also caught up in a scandal involving her acceptance of a $2,000 Dior bag, an alleged breach of South Korea's anti-corruption laws. The opposition tried 3 times to introduce a bill seeking a special investigation into the First Lady. Yoon vetoed them all. For all the scandals and his perceived inability to rule the country, the South Korean president would be severely punished at the polls. In April 2024, the Democratic Party won a landslide majority in South Korea's parliamentary election. The opposition, now in control of the National Assembly, would go on to slash Yoon's budget. This led many observers to call him a lame duck president who still had nearly 3 years left to go in his term. Then on December 3rd at 10:27 p.m., Yoon shocked the nation.
저는 북한 공산 세력의 위협으로부터 자유 대한민국을 수호하고 우리 국민의 자유와 행복을 약탈하고 있는 파렴치한 종북 반국가 세력들을 일거에 척결하고 자유 헌정 질서를 지키기 위해 비상계엄을 선포합니다.
For the first time in over 40 years, martial law was imposed across South Korea. This act was met with fury by the South Korean public, who had spent decades moving past military rule. Spontaneous protests immediately broke out. Opposition lawmakers broke through lines of police and military officers, trying to keep them from entering the National Assembly. Once inside, they unanimously voted to lift martial law.
비상계엄 해제 요구 결의안은 가결되었음을 선포합니다.
And at 4:30 a.m. on December 4th, Yoon and his cabinet complied.
국회의 계엄 해제 요구가 있어 계엄 사무에 투입된 군을 철수시켰습니다.
Calls for Yoon's arrest and impeachment were immediate.
이제 탄핵을 넘어서 정당한 절차를 거쳐서 수사를 받고 모든 대가를 치러야 된다고 생각합니다.
In the days that followed, protests grew and members of Yoon's cabinet resigned and were arrested. Police opened an investigation into allegations of rebellion and abuse of power. Despite calls for Yoon to step down, he remained adamant he would not. He survived his first impeachment vote on December 7th. A week later, the opposition secured enough votes to impeach Yoon, and he was suspended from duty.
대통령 윤석열 탄핵 소추안은 총 투표수 300표 중 가 204표, 부 85표, 기권 3표, 무효 8표로서 가결되었음을 선포합니다.
저는 결코 포기하지 않겠습니다. 저를 향한 질책, 격려와 성원을 모두 마음에 품고 마지막 순간까지 국가를 위해 최선을 다하겠습니다.
For days, Yoon stood defiant. An attempt to arrest Yoon on January 3rd failed after a 6-hour standoff between investigators and military troops controlled by the Presidential Security Service. Meanwhile, outside the presidential compound, die-hard Yoon supporters, some who had camped out overnight, scuffled with police. On January 15th, police finally apprehended Yoon, who reluctantly accepted his arrest.
불법이 자행되고 무효인 영장에 의해서 절차를 강압적으로 진행하는 것을 보고 정말 개탄스럽지 않을 수 없습니다.
On January 26th, along with his impeachment trial, Yoon was also formally indicted on rebellion charges. In subsequent hearings, the suspended president presented his arguments. Yoon said he never intended to fully implement the martial law order, that it was just a political ploy to warn of the opposition's abuse of parliamentary power. He added that he never ordered the military to break into parliament to stop the vote to rescind the martial law order, and that it did not matter since no one was harmed. On March 8th, Yoon was released from detention after prosecutors decided not to appeal a court decision to cancel his arrest warrant. As the court's decision dragged on for months, Yoon's supporters and critics took to the streets. When the Constitutional Court's decision finally arrived on April 4th, justices unanimously voted to uphold Yoon's impeachment.
법치국가 원리와 민주국가 원리의 기본 원칙들을 위반한 것으로 그 자체로 헌법 질서를 침해하고 민주공화정의 안정성에 심각한 위해를 끼쳤습니다. 청구인은 국군의 정치적 중립성을 침해하고 헌법에 따른 국군 통수 의무를 위반하였습니다. 3.
Yoon was immediately removed from office and awaits a separate verdict in his criminal trial. South Korean law requires the nation to choose a new leader within 60 days in an election that many hope will turn the page on the divisive Yoon presidency.